Welcome to the Jay Martin Show, where we dissect the greatest minds in geopolitics and finance. Now, what can carry you forward can also eventually drag you down. This is a lesson that we see on repeat in both the business world and in geopolitics again and again and again in the rise and fall of nations. And we use that as a framework today to understand the probable outcomes of U.S. and China competitiveness. We step back from the hyperbole today, away from the sensational headlines, and dive into what's real. With my guest, Richard Wolff, famed economist and author. I learned a ton in today's discussion. I know you're going to as well. This was a very concise and comprehensive deep dive into the potential outcomes of geopolitics today between the East and the West. I know you're going to love it. Here is Richard Wolff. Enjoy.
This is Jay Martin.
All right, here I am with Richard Wolff. Richard, it's great to have you on the program. Thank you for making the time.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So I want to start with a big question. I'll leave it open-ended, go whichever direction you want, and then I'm just going to pull on some threads and we'll take it from there. Okay. But a popular speculation on my channel is people love to speculate about the outcome of U.S. China competitiveness. You do a lot of this in your writing and your work, so we'll start with that. What would you like to share your thoughts on that subject?
Okay, I should begin with a caveat. I don't really much believe in predicting the future. I understand it's an amusement. You go to the amusement park and there's an interesting person and you give them a couple of bucks and they tell you what your future will be and you enjoy it and you have a good laugh. If you start agonizing over what they just told you, then you've misunderstood an entertainment for an actual capability. Nobody can predict the future. I can't either. What I can do and what substitutes for that, and I want to put it on the table, is I can tell you where things are going, and on the assumption, and that's all it is, that they will continue in the future sort of more or less like they've been doing in the past, well then, I can then tell you what will happen. Over the last 30 to 40 years, we have been witnessing, those of us willing to look at it, we've been witnessing an absolutely unique phenomena. The People's Republic of China, whatever you think about it, and I'm not really here neither to condemn nor to endorse anything about it, but if you have eyes to see, you will see economic development achieving things nobody thought were possible. I have a PhD in economics. I got it, as it happens, from Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut. It has a big program in economic development, and I took those courses and I learned all that stuff. Nobody understood in those days what the Chinese were doing. And in those days, it was only the beginning, and you could be excused for not paying all that much attention. They were one of many very poor countries in the world who were trying to stop being poor countries in the world. Americans might have read the novel by Pearl Buck, The Good Earth. If you ever did read that book, we had to in high school. Well, you learned what the poverty was like. It was, for a suburban kid like me, it was hard to get my head around what that kind of poverty is like. In the last 30 to 40 years, the Chinese achieved a level of economic development that took several centuries in Western Europe. And it took a good century and a half, counting conservatively, here in the United States. We've never seen anything like it. What the Chinese did was to mobilize, borrow from the rest of the world, no question, but put all that together in a successful mix. If your measuring rod is economic growth, lifting people out of poverty, and let's remember, 1.4 billion people, 4 to 5 times the population of the United States. They were able to do it. Not only that, they now compete with the United States at the highest levels of technology. What we get from Intel or Apple or, any of the, they have their equivalent. And in some cases, they're already ahead of us. I'll give you an example. 10 or 15 years ago, every major car producing company in the world undertook a program to develop the electric car, the electric vehicle, to replace the fossil fuel burning oil and gas vehicle. Okay, everybody did that. And we have many examples of that being produced. However, one example outranks everybody else. The electric cars of China are better and cheaper than anybody else's. They won the competition. That happens all the time. Just other companies in other countries at other times won equivalent competitions. The response of the United States has been to impose a tariff to make the better, cheaper electric car from China unaffordable. The current rate of tariff applied by the Biden government is 100%. So, for example, if the electric car from China costs you $30,000 that have to be sent to China to pay for the car, you've got to give them the car dealer $30,000 to pay off the Chinese, and another $30,000, 100%, goes to Uncle Sam, so that the cost to an American would be $60,000 for that $30,000 car. Okay? There are no electric cars from China on the road in the United States. A quarter of the electric cars on the road in Europe are the Chinese cars. The greatest producer, the most successful, the most rapidly growing car company in the world, most Americans have never heard of. It has 3 initials, B as in boy, Y, and D as in dog, BYD Corporation. The response of the United States is to freeze them out. This is self-defeating and, to be an economist for a moment, stupid. Why? Everywhere else in the world, as the transition to electric vehicles is underway, every competitor of the United States across all industries will be able to buy the best car at $30,000 with which to compete with the American company, whereas the American company is going to have to pay more than $30,000 for the non-tariff equivalent, which will cost you $40,000 to $50,000 for an inferior vehicle. I don't know, but when I went to school and they taught me economics, this is somewhere between self-defeating and stupid, and a little bit of both. And since I come out of the American education system, I enjoy telling people, because it gives them something to think about, that when I got my PhD in economics at Yale years ago, my classmate was a woman. There weren't very many women taking those courses then. So she, I remember her because she was unusual. Her name was Janet Yellen. Okay, she's now the Secretary of the Treasury in the United States government. I know that she knows what I just mentioned to you is the case. She knows it's self-defeating. She knows it's stupid. She's out there advocating it because that's the position of the government. The United States is losing the competition with China. I could give you many more examples if you wish. This is a self-defeating behavior, typically of somebody who's desperate. Instead of outcompeting the Chinese, coming up with a plan to try at least to do that, you are, lifting up the barriers. They tell themselves in Washington that they're isolating the Chinese. They're not. They're isolating themselves. And the rest of the world is watching in bemused. The Germans have a word for it. It's called Schadenfreude. The rest of the world looking at the United States, and they see an empire going down, and they get the pleasure that comes from that. And we ought to wake up as a nation and figure this out.
Okay. Okay, thank you for that. There's a handful of strings I want to pull on here.
Good.
First of all, just a question for you about the rapid acceleration of Chinese development. You referenced what the Chinese economy has been able to accomplish in a much quicker time than we saw in the West, than we ever saw in Europe. And right away, I got to wonder two things. Number one, as we, so to speak, stand on the shoulders of giants, we should grow faster and bigger than our predecessors. And that's often been the case. The Dutch Empire was greater than the Spanish Empire, the British bigger than the Dutch, et cetera, et cetera. So maybe that's sort of a factor of human nature. And then because they were starting from such a low base, I mean, this is coming out of the century of humiliation in China. The country had been devastated. A lot of folks in the West don't know, but when America was fighting its civil war and 600,000 people died, China was fighting their civil war and 20 to 30 million people died. It was a scale that's very difficult to wrap our minds around and how devastating and violent that war was. But that's the era that China was coming out of, right? And so it's a very low base, which can make growth look a lot faster. Now, I'm not taking anything away from the progress and advancements of the Chinese economy, but I wonder if that provides any valuable context. Richard, what are your thoughts?
Well, first of all, I agree with you. That is the pattern. And thank God it's the pattern. I mean, do we want to reinvent the wheel all the time? No, we want to realize that people before us were smart and struggled with the environment and came up with new ways and better ways of doing things. And I'm grateful for that happening. But I have to tell you as an economist, every part of the poor world, and the poor world is the vast majority of Asia, Africa, Latin America, for sure, plus large parts of North America and Europe too. But let's talk about Asia, Africa, Latin America, vast majority of the people's world, the majority of the people's resources. They are all terribly poor. They all wanted 40 years ago to do something, but the Chinese actually did it. That's the question that has to be asked. Did they build on what went before? Absolutely. Absolutely they did. The Chinese, for example, and this is misrepresented in the West, again, for defensive reasons, which I understand, I even empathize. But, in the light of day, you can't stay with it. People say that the Chinese built on the West's technology. That's true. Of course that's true. But the Chinese didn't do that in any mysterious way. 25 years ago, they made a decision that they would say to the developed world whom they hoped to imitate. The United States, Western Europe, Japan, and so on. We will give you a deal. We understand you're capitalists. We understand that profit is the bottom line, blah, blah, blah. And here's what we're going to give you. Two things. Number one, an educated, disciplined, incredibly cheap labor force. And number two, the biggest growing market in the world. Look, I'm a professor of economics. I've taught in business schools on and off all my life. In a business school, we tell budding young entrepreneurs, if you want to know where to go and focus your energy, go where the labor is cheap and the market is growing. Okay. They went to China. And they went because they did exactly what we told them to do. They made a ton of money. That forced all of those who were not yet ready to do that to realize if you don't go to China too, these guys are going to outcompete you. They're going to bring that stuff back, made with cheaper labor, and they have the Chinese market. General Motors now sells more cars in China than it does in the United States. These are the developments, and everybody wanted to do it, but the Chinese did it. And by the way, I don't mean to single them out so much. The Indians, by that I mean the people in the country called India, the Indians, they are doing a version of it. Not the version the Chinese, and they can't quite match the Chinese yet, but they are. And the whole organization called the BRICS is an organization that is internationalizing the Chinese model. And that too ought to worry the United States a great deal more than it currently does. By
Okay.
the way, Canada is a sad, at this point, from my perspective, I'm not a Canadian. I'm an American citizen. I've lived and worked in America all my life. But the Canadians are following the Americans in these behaviors. And I don't think that's any better for Canada than it is for the United States.
Yeah, I agreed. I mean, I'd love to go down that rabbit hole with you as well. Before I have one more China specific question, and then I want to expand globally a little bit. But this does this give us any useful examples? Because over the last 100 years, we could see an example of a socialist system being the Soviet Union. We can see an example of a capitalist system being America, and then a hybrid system, right? A sort of socialist-capitalist system in China. Right. And the way I've heard you describe the Chinese economy is along those lines. And it made me think of this analogy. I'll tell it to you. You let me know what you think about it. The Chinese economy is almost run like a corporation in that there's owners, there's executives, there's managers, and there's employees. And the employees work for the managers work for the executives answer to the owners, but the employees don't really interact with the owners much at all, meaning there's top-down authority for sure. But among the departments, there's a level of autonomy that is allowed to function somewhat independently unless in extraordinary circumstances, word comes down from the top. So you have the ultra centralized socialist system, which we saw did not work in Russia in that example. We have a massively decentralized system in America, and then this hybrid, which is centralized, decentralized to a point. Is that an accurate description? And what are your thoughts?
Well, here's my thought. I don't mean to flatter you, but if I were teaching in the university, which is what I've done all my life, you'd get a big A on your paper if you wrote that down. That's right. But I mean, look what you've said here. You have recognized that the 20th century bequeaths to us the American, let's call it the Anglo-American mostly private economic system, private enterprise, private capitalist, profiting, all of that, and bequeathed of the Soviet Union. The attempt as an alternative to build it with government-owned and operated enterprises, at least in the industrial sector, not so much in agriculture, but there too. So there we have these, let's call them, for lack of a better, a polar opposite. Then it's not surprising, given how human beings work, that along would come a group of people who have something they don't like about the first one and something they don't like about the second one. And so they conceive the idea, would we get from a hybrid something that would capture the best of the one, the best of the other, and get rid of, discard the parts of both of them that we don't like? You could, I think, make a very good case that that's what Mao Zedong, the Chinese Communist Party, that's what they are. People forget, but they shouldn't, that in the 1960s, Soviet Union and their proteges in China came to war with one another. I mean, they did not agree on things that would make them shoot at each other's people and hurt each other. I mean, the divisions were very profound. So no one should be surprised that the Chinese made the decision to welcome foreign enterprise, to say to them, bring us your technology because you are ahead of us in a dozen ways, which they said. If you read Chinese journals, they've been full of that for years. Much of what those Chinese journals did was to take from the United States and try to figure out how to do the same thing a little bit better. But 90% of what they did was learn from the United States. And, and they paid for that in all the ways they normally. Nobody stole that's childish. Nobody put a gun to the heads of the American companies that went over and made the deal. We will give you our technology. We will show it to you. We'll teach it to you. You got to give us the labor. You got to give us access to the market. We're getting profit out of it. You're getting technology. That was the deal. That was a deal on the table, crystal clear. To represent it now is really cheating. It's like my saying, I'm going to give you $5. You give me your shirt, and we make the exchange. I now have $5. You have my $5. I got your shirt, and then I start screaming, he stole my shirt. No, stop. You didn't steal my shirt. We had a deal. You may have changed your mind. You may regret it. That's another matter. But nobody stole anything from you. And the Chinese, they resent that because for them, and I've had these conversations, for them, that's the 100 years of humiliation again. Because what they hear is the subtext. You're too stupid, you're too backward, you're too Chinese to figure these things out. And so you must have stolen it. You couldn't have done it without, we are the center. And I know where it comes from. For a good long while, the United States was the center of innovation, was the great breakthrough technology. Silicon Valley deserves part of the reputation it has. I get that. But so do the achievements on the basis of that. And if you're honest about Silicon Valley, you'll know that a lot of what they did there was also borrowing things that had been developed elsewhere in the world, as it has always been.
Yeah, and as should be the case. I mean, that's kind of our role, right, is to learn and iterate and improve.
To make the world better when we leave it than when we found it.
Yes. Okay. I do have one more question on China. I don't know if this is relevant, but one thing I've been reading a lot about and I'm very curious about is, how did the technological advancement reversal occur? And what I mean is that we now think of the most advanced economies mainly being Western, the greatest explorers in the world. We think of people like Captain James Cook or Marco Polo or Christopher Columbus, all Europeans. But it wasn't that long before that. In fact, nearly 100 years before Columbus set sail on the 3,000-mile journey to America, there was a Chinese explorer named Zheng He who traveled 10,000 miles from China to East Africa. And whereas Columbus traveled with 3 ships and 90 men, I believe, Zheng He had 300 ships, 27,000 men, 180 doctors, magnetic compasses, scrolls upon scrolls of accurate maps, whereas Columbus quite literally had no idea where he was. He bumped into a continent he didn't know existed. And this is one of many examples of how advanced the celestial empire of China was relative to Western economies. But something big happened between Zheng He and Captain Elliot arriving in Guangzhou during the onset of the Opium Wars. Something major shifted. Do you have any thoughts on that, Richard?
Yes. First of all, your history is correct. It's the same sense I have. And again, it's something we find kind of often. If you have a society that arises on the decay of another one of the things that often happens is a kind of, for lack of a better term, chauvinism. That is, the winner in the game rewrites the history. And in that history, their own people, their own communities are the dynamic, are the breakthrough, are the, and the achievements of others are second rate or they're downplayed. And then it's not a big step until they're forgotten altogether. So, for me, the example is baseball. When I was young, I was in love with American baseball. And I was in love with a sport that I understood was white. And I remember occurring to me, why are there no black people in the baseball? And the answer was, they don't do that. Or they can't do that. I was around early enough that I remember the importance of Jackie Robinson as the breakthrough black player. Nowadays, we understand that black people, to be as mild about it as I can, are very good at sports and are very important in our professional sports, like overwhelmingly so. And that they were, now you get the idea, they were not out of the game because of their athletic skills. There were other reasons. And the same thing I think applies here. If your economy is based in a certain way of making decisions, then your civilization rises and falls on that basis. The collapse of the Chinese empires of the past were that they were built on, to use the language of economics, a feudal class structure, a class structure of lords and serfs, like what we had in Europe in the 1,000 years between the end of Rome and the Renaissance, or however you want to date it, it doesn't matter. But that system, which enabled European feudal society to achieve remarkable things, also was the seeds of their own downfall. And why do I say that? because it's directly applicable to what's the China story. China wants to cash in on all the achievements of private capitalism, which are significant, modern industrialization, all of that. But they are also aware, partly because of their ideology, that what can carry you forward can also drag you down. And you've got to be careful to understand that possibility, to be alert for it, and not to miss it when it comes. And here's how it came to the United States and China. We innovate in this country insofar and when it is profitable to somebody to develop it. Somebody sees, oh, I can make a ton of money doing it this way or this new way. We celebrate that. We are proud of it. And it achieved a lot. I'm the last one to deny it. I teach that material to my students. What did the Chinese do? They said, yes, but if you make that the key, if the only innovation program you undertake is the one that is privately profitable, you are going to miss opportunities, you are going to underfund opportunities, and it's going to drag you down. We in China, this is how they explain it. We in China say half the economy, you do that private profit-driven technological, do it. And we'll let you become millionaire. After the United States, China is the second country in terms of the number of private millionaires and billionaires that they have. So they've allowed that to happen. But in the other half of the economy, we're not doing that. We're going to make decisions about economic development, including technological change, based on the social objectives the Communist Party and its government define. So, for example, we want to be ahead of the United States in certain new areas. We didn't have private enterprise to undertake it. Who cares? We'll do it. We'll do it. Maybe the private will catch on later and they'll do it. Okay, then we'll do something else. But as long as we're going to make decisions, and there's the solution. They are able to say, we're going to invest in things that Americans don't. Is it because Americans can't? No. Do we lack the technology? No. Do we have the scientists who can do it? Yes. But we have an economic system that is so set up that those opportunities that aren't now privately profitable get the short end of the stick. They're not never there, but they are the ones that we dream about, but we don't invest in. They don't do that. They have a wholly, when they talk, they say, is profit important to us? Yes. Is it the beginning and the end of the conversation? Oh, no, not the bottom line. It is one among a set of objectives, and our strategy is focused on all those objectives, not the prioritization of private profit. By the way, that's what they mean. When they say socialism, that's what they mean. Right.
Again, this is interesting. I keep on coming back to the corporation analogy in the sense that I run a team of about 12 and I set the vision and the policy decisions and the big strategic decisions. But I also understand that the more autonomy I can give my people, the better we're going to do, because my sales team is just going to have the best real-time feedback when it comes to product development. My marketing team, the same. My production team, the same, because they're on the front lines and they know. But also, if there's not the balance, if they made all the decisions on the sales team front, for example, we would chase today's income. Every decision would come down to what can we convert today, and we would probably abandon the long-term strategy because we're commission incentivized to get paid today, right? So it takes that. You need that balance, right, of the top down, but autonomy granted, and then striking that and juggling that's a whole other thing.
Well, I could, if I could interrupt, I could introduce you to a dozen Chinese strategists who would say what you just said in the identical language.
Interesting.
That's how they understand what they do. And by the way, they're poetic. They talk about, as I'm sure you know from your hands-on experience, it's easy to say it, But to navigate the differences between decentralized and centralized, to be sensitive enough to let the people at the bottom who have immediate knowledge act on it, even if you're not so sure, you can be. That's a very, I mean, either you're good at that or you're not, but that's a people relationship. They're full of that. They're very conscious, and they're very aware of mistakes they made where they, by the way, the mistakes they typically, and I don't think it's very fair, but they do it. They say, when we do things like you guys do in the West, we make terrible mistakes. That's their way of saying we have lots to learn about the relationship between central authority and decentralized autonomy. And we're at the beginning of that process, and we make lots of mistakes.
Yes. Okay. Now something you said a couple of minutes ago, what can carry you forward can also drag you down.
Right.
Can you relate that statement to the American empire in any way for me?
Yes. I mean, more ways than I could enumerate if we had 20 hours. Right now, we maintain, as a nation, 700 to 800 military bases around the world. No other country does anything remotely like that. That is not just very expensive, but that is also a kind of running the world, if not by hitting people, by threatening to hit people, because we have troops and planes and bombs and missiles and all over, right? I mean, right in your neighborhood and not far from. What are we doing? Well, we came out of a situation where we thought this would protect us. And in some ways it did. And even in some ways, I'll grant it does. But you have to ask the question, what else is it doing? And the answer is, it is defining the United States as the holder backer of what we are trying to do here in the Ivory Republic in Africa, or in Malaysia, or in Paraguay. It is the entity that's having a hold on the world, trying to hold us back. When the American naval fleet sits in the South China Sea, a stone's throw from Taiwan, nobody cares about Taiwan. Nobody is fooled by this. Maybe a few Americans who are naive. This is not about Taiwan. Taiwan is not a concern for China either. It's the symbolism of it all. And it allows the Chinese, whether you like them or not, it's another matter. It allows the Chinese to say, look at them. They are here threatening us because we are out competing them. And neither you or I can resolve how honest or true that is. It's got some truth. It's got some exaggeration. But we are giving them the ammunition, if you like, with which to characterize us in this way. I'll give you another example. There's an enormous opposition inside Europe to the war with Russia in Ukraine. There are many, many Europeans, pro-capitalist, anti-capitalist, across the board, who think that is the worst mistake of their lifetimes, that struggle. They are clear in their mind, and I'm not arguing whether they're right or wrong. I'll be glad to do that if you want, but here's where they are. It's wrong. They should never have done it. It's stupid. The Russians will win. The Ukrainians will lose. End of story. It's a waste of money. And it is making the people of Europe furious because we're cutting back social programs while we fund a losing war that we don't care about in the first place. Okay? You don't have to agree with that, but that's a real problem. What are you going to do? You had 3 elections in the last few weeks. Britain, France, and Germany. Every one of those elections should tell you the same thing. The mass of people are rejecting the conventional politicians. You better be careful, because if they're doing that there, they're going to do it here too. Maybe Trump is halfway there already. Maybe what comes next will be more. Let me give you an example. For 15 years, you had the conservatives. As the conditions of existence of the British working class declined over the last 20 years, and they declined worse than anywhere else in the Western world, the British, The conservatives came up with the great idea, blame the Europeans. That's right up there with the United States today, blame the immigrants. Are you crazy? The United States is a country of 330 million. Undocumented immigrants in this country, maybe 10 to 15 million people. And among them, the poorest people on the planet. They are not going to shape the economy of 330 million. That's childish. Mm-hmm. That never happened, isn't happening now, and isn't about to happen. But if people are upset enough, and they are, and if they've suffered enough, and they have, then they are vulnerable to being told, okay, so the British did it. They left Europe with great fanfare, 10 years ago, a little less, 2016. Brexit. Okay, they have Brexit. Their condition got worse, not better, which any fool could have told them. Why? Because that's not your problem. There are pros and cons about Europe. That's another. But the notion that by separating yourself from Europe, you're going to solve your problems, you got to be crazy. It's like if you stop the flow of immigrants across the border into Texas, you're going to make a friggin' bit of difference. It's just childish. But this is what people who are smart people do when they're jammed. Now let's look at France. France has a middle-of-the-road leader, a nice young man, so he hasn't got age as a problem, Mr. Macron. Okay? In the National Assembly vote a month or two ago, 3 major parties contested. A left-wing party that's virtually fascist by Marine Le Pen, the National Front. His own party, the sitting president of the country, and a unity of 4 little leftist parties. The French Socialist Party, the French Communist Party, the French Green Party, and a French Socialist Party that takes the name France Unbowed. Those 4 came together. And you know what the French people did for their president? His party came in 3rd out of 3. Mm-hmm. The number 1 party was a party led by a former member of the French Communist Party, who is still a big leftist. That's the largest political bloc in the French Assembly right now. And then in Germany, you had an election. It wasn't national the way it was in Britain and France. It was in the eastern region. 2 or 3 Länder, they're called in Germany. They're like states in the United States, roughly. Okay, in those, the right-wing quasi-fascist party that has arisen in Germany, and that's an achievement, man, because Germany is where they had Nazis and Hitler. So to be a right-wing, to salute with Hitler, to have a swastika on your shirt it's something anywhere in the world, but to do it in Germany, amazing. They came in first. Who came in second? A relative political unknown. A woman, Sarah Wagenknecht, who is a Marxist, has been a Marxist all her life, was a fixture of the Marxist left in Germany, decided to run on her own, and comes in second. Okay, what we're seeing here is a rejection of the status quo on a massive scale. You got to deal with that, and none of them are. You know what Mr. Starmer, the new head of Britain, his first 2 acts as the new Labour Party prime minister? He's cutting fuel assistance to poor people in England as they face the coming winter where they are desperately in need. Why? Because fuel has gone up in price. Why? Because the British can't get their hands on Russian oil and gas, which is the cheap way Britain has heated itself in wintertime. So they can see real clear the connection with Ukraine and Russia on the one hand and their own suffering. And you know what else Mr. Starmer said is, besides saving money on giving fuel aid to the poor, he's going to give more to Ukraine. Man, this is the end for him. This is the end for the Labour Party. They are creating a situation where the British working class is going to finally figure out that relying on the Conservatives and the Labour Party back and forth between these two is not solving their problem. And why am I telling you this? Because in the United States, we are in the midst of the process of our working class reaching the same conclusion about the Republicans and the Democrats. Mm. This is holding back. These conflicts play out. Britain is a basket case economically and becoming more so. They don't even address the problems they have. They are so caught up in not being willing to face their real problems and make the changes. The empire is gone. And no matter how pompous the inauguration of their new King Charles, it doesn't make it more than a piece of Hollywood theater.
Okay, so I want to select my thread here to pull on. quite a few. It's a buffet here. So let me go with this. I have heard from a very small number of individuals, like maybe George Friedman of Geopolitical Insights. He's very bullish on America, and he describes the rise of populism, the division, which you alluded to in America, as growing pains of an adolescent empire. He's like, this is traditional American rage. The protests and riots you see in the street, even down to the violence. This is a consequence of a free economy that can't express themselves in the street. And we're going through some very severe growing pains right now. The other side of it is the brightest days of America's future. Now, you can step outside the borders of America and say, well, look at the recession of, empire influence, right? And, the way that China is sort of co-opting the global south, or you could say the global majority. I mean, that's who lives in those countries, and the most favorable demographics, by the way, in those countries as well. But maybe back to George Friedman's comments about this is not the decay of the American empire. These are growing pains of an adolescent empire, and we're still young in our journey. What's your take on that, Richard?
Well, it's partly what I said at the beginning of this conversation. I can't engage with George Friedman or anyone else in speculations. I mean, he has every right to imagine where this could go. He imagines it that way.
Right.
I don't see that. If you say to me, is that a possible story? Yeah, it's possible. Maybe I will, you and I will have a conversation X years from now, and you'll remind me, and I'll say, you were right, I was wrong. Is it possible? Sure, it's right. We all do the best we can. But the notion, the imagery of the adolescent, I wish I could buy into that. I don't see. I see the behavior of old. I see the behavior of old mechanisms held on to. The Chinese a year ago began to deliver around the world a statistical result, which the United Nations endorsed. Doesn't mean it's true or anything, but it went like this. Over the last 10 years, we have raised 800 million people out of poverty here in China. Their average income went from X to Y. Y is higher than X by enough to say they are no longer in poverty, they are in modest, or whatever the terms are that the UN uses. Okay. It doesn't matter whether it's exaggerated or not. Probably is, but who knows? But it's the right thing to say. It gives them the word that the rest of the world, the overwhelming majority of the rest of the world, is most interested in. How can we do that? Let me give you a statistic just to try to help people get a handle on it. I recently was invited to give a speech to an organization in Lagos, Nigeria. And in order to prepare for that speech and what they asked me to talk about, I went back to reacquaint myself with this example of Africa in relationship to the United States. And I did it because Nigeria is a very important country in Africa, one of the most important, maybe the most important in Africa. Okay, here's a 1-minute summary. The population of Nigeria, which will amaze people, is 220 million people. Okay, that's 2/3 of the United States in Nigeria. Mm-hmm. So we are a country, the United States now, is a country 50% larger than Nigeria. We have 50% more people, roughly. Mm-hmm. Okay. What is the GDP, the gross domestic product, the total output of goods and services achieved in Nigeria in one calendar year recently, 2022, 2023, whatever I could get? $500 billion, so about $500 billion, give or take. What is the GDP of the United States recent year? 22, 23 trillion. Okay, that means that while the United States is 50% more people, it has 50 times the wealth of Nigeria. Now, I don't think that's a sustainable arrangement for anybody. No matter what your economics are, or your politics, or the ideology, or anything, that's not sustainable. You cannot, especially in a world where those 220 million are in a position, which they are, to learn all about the difference. But this is not going to work. And indeed, the proof of it was that the people who invited me to speak there believed that. And that's what they wanted me to talk about, because they find it intolerable. And they're upset and they're bitter and they're angry, or they're, a good number of Nigerians leave Nigeria. They don't want to, but the difference between the life they can lead in the United States or Europe or someplace else is just so enormous that for their husband or their wife or their kids, look, I understand all of that. My parents are refugees from Europe. They came to the United States to survive and to do better, which they did. But it's not sustainable. You got to do something. You cannot fob that off. But in fact, that's what's being done. Neither Europe nor the United States is addressing this question. Just doesn't do it. Gives them verbalisms, give them noise, just noise. The Chinese are everywhere, building bridges, erecting schools. It's just, it's amazing to watch. And we're making it, let me goad your audience. We in the West, we are making it easier for this to blow up in our face. This self-defense of pretending this isn't going on is killing us. It's just, it's like watching a slow motion train heading into a stone wall. You want to scream at the people on the train, stop the train, get off the train. You have the power, you can do it. Pull the brake. Yell at the conductor, do something, but they're so busy partying that they don't recognize what's happening.
I think the Nigeria example is very important because it brings us, from my perspective, back to the front end of this conversation where we talked about China's ascent over the last 100 years, how quickly and how successful that's been. And when you look at Nigeria, and the GDP, 50 times larger in America, we're kind of like, obviously, like Nigeria's a mess, right? But also the way to look at that is like massive upside potential, right? Yeah. Massive upside potential. And with the right investment, access to cheap technology, consumer goods, which China will continue to provide, those are the demographics that make those quantum leaps when the stars align, and they very well might. I have another question.
If
Please.
I can,
yeah.
Here's an example that might crystallize it in people's mind. If you go to Lagos, you will see huge, it's one of the great cities of the world. It's an enormous city, right? I'm going to exaggerate, but not by much. Everybody's working with their little Apple telephone. That telephone, which is making a lot of money because you can sell that to those people, they save up because for them it's an enormous expense. But it's also a window on what their economy doesn't have.
Yeah.
It's a window on everything the Chinese want to get across to them.
Mm-hmm.
So you can see that by giving them that, which is profitable, so we do it, you are also giving them an appetite for being critical of profit. And you have to understand that. You can't pretend it isn't happening, and you can't wave your finger and say it oughtn't to, because those are empty gestures. They do nothing. The reality is the people of Nigeria are in the process of figuring out, and I can assure you of this, the questions I got at the end of my talk were brilliant. Those people understood what I was saying and a lot more, and peppered me with very good questions. They want big changes. You're not going to fob this generation off. Maybe you could with their parents. They said that about their own parents, but not them. And I can see it. I can see it all over the place.
That's interesting. Okay, so there's a lot of conversation on my channel and many of my peers' channels about the first question I asked you, which was, let's speculate on the outcome of China-U.S. competitiveness. A lot of this conversation trends towards war. There's a bleak outlook, a lot of hyperbole, a lot of sensationalism, and a lot of analysis look at the current hot conflicts in Europe and the Middle East as precursors to World War III. That's what's next. Now, maybe another way to look at this, and I'd love to get your take, is thinking back to when America fought for their independence from England. Horrible time for the UK and very disastrous economically. I think inflation hit 30% at the beginning of the 19th century in England because they lost a big chunk of their economy. The British East India Company had invested so aggressively in American cotton plantations and yada, yada, yada. Horrible situation. Fast forward not that long, and America becomes England's most important ally, and is probably the reason that the UK didn't fall to Nazi Germany, because America was able to come to their defense. Mm-hmm. Now, short-term pain, long-term gain. That's my point, I guess. As we move from a unipolar world to probably some kind of a multipolar world, is a scenario like that at all likely, or are the East and West too ideologically different for an outcome like that? Like, is there a mutually beneficial outcome here that is being ignored because the optimistic headlines never get read? People want to know about war and crashes and catastrophes, when maybe there's actually a productive outcome that is more logical and probable, but nobody wants to hear about that. What's your take?
I'm on the side of there is a better solution. There is more logic. There is greater probability. I don't even mind being accused of being an optimist if that's what someone wants to say. Let me explain to you why, though, why I feel that way, and I'll pick up on your history. The British Empire, already beginning its decline, its peaking, at that time, the time of the American Revolution, the time of the French Revolution, the time of the fact that basically Napoleon ended it, even though they finished him off, he also ended them. There was an attempt by the British to prevent the United States from becoming what it had the potential, we now know, to do. It fought a war. And to its own amazement, it lost the war of 1776. And they tried again in 1812. We had another war, again with Britain, again designed to crush this newcomer, and the British lost again. And they concluded after those two wars that they weren't going to get the problem solved militarily. To make a long, complex story short, they said, if you can beat them, join them. Work something out that allows them to grow and allows you to survive and to grow in your way. You as a young economy, you as a more mature economy. It's not coincidental that it's a very few years from the War of 1812 to the declaration of the Monroe Doctrine, when the United States says, okay, we're now one of the big players, Latin America, the Western Hemisphere is ours. It's our colonial backyard.
Mhm.
And you Europeans, you can do what you want in Africa, Asia, but not here. That's ours. Okay. That's the assertion. We have a deal. We're going to get our colonial needs met over here. You do your worst over there. We won't bother you there, but you can't bother us here. All right. That is an arrangement. And that avoided another war between the United States and Britain, who could become allies, who could even survive the embarrassment, which is what it was, that the colony became the master of the colony. That literally the roles got reversed, and we now look at the British as quaint because we're the power and they are the afterthought. Mm. They pretend they're not, but everybody who. So here's my answer. I think there are very basic similarities between the United States and China, which I would be glad to tell you about. And those are more than enough that a comparable deal could be and should be worked out. Nuclear war is not an option unless you're lunatic. And I'm assuming that the prevailing mentality in Washington, in Beijing, and everywhere else is not lunatics. I may be wrong about that. I'm not privy. I don't have any inside information, but I'm hopeful that the nuclear war option. I'm also, and I say this as an American, Americans don't understand what terrible war is. They just don't. They've never suffered being on the losing end of a major war fought on their own territory. The Chinese have, the Japanese have, the Russians have, the Europeans have, and I could go on, but we haven't. In World War II, bombs fell in Hawaii at Pearl Harbor, and never again. No American city has ever gone through that. The only time I ever went to a bomb shelter was when I was a student in my public school here in the United States, and they taught us how to get under our desk in case there was a bomb, which none of us understood and thought was a funny game. It's not and when Americans talk about war, there's a bravado that sounds like a bad cowboy movie in which, you see the shooting, and then when it's over, everybody gets up and goes and has a cup of coffee or a beer. It's not a real trauma that settles into the consciousness. I grew up with my grandma. Every time there was a loud noise in our bedroom, and we were very safe and secure, my grandma jumped. Why? Because she had been in the war in Europe, and a loud noise, it's like a soldier who comes back from the battlefield and takes years or a whole lifetime to disconnect from the anxieties buried in them. So my view is, here's what's similar. The Chinese never broke, not yet, from the capitalist commitment to organize production in a particular way. And that way has a small group of people at the top. You spoke about it earlier, we both did. They'll make the basic decisions. They decide basically what's going to be produced, how it's going to be produced, where it's going to be produced, and what is done with the revenue. And the rest of the people are employees. And they have the monopoly of the power. Do they share some of it? Sure they do, especially if they're smart, they understand. But that's where the power is, and that's where the wealth accumulates, because they keep whatever the net revenue is, a disproportionate amount for the owners and the top executives and all the rest. The Chinese don't do all that different, but they do substitute state officials, so that is very different. But they, ironically, are going to have a harder time maintaining that system than we in the West, because we have the ideological rationalization of it all. We teach, as I have done all my life, in the university, that this capitalist arrangement is necessary, is efficient, and It's all bullshit. It's a complete, and I teach it, but I know that it's nonsense. I know what I'm doing. I'm teaching an ideology. This is like teaching a catechism in a Catholic school, if you know, or any other religion. I don't mean to pick out Roman Catholicism. I know that we're teaching an ideology that rationalizes that. The problem in China, they teach an ideology that doesn't. If you open up Marx's Capital, which they teach people to do, Marx is all about there's another way of doing things, ladies and gentlemen. And in this country, we call it a worker co-op. It's a horizontally organized enterprise. It's a community that decides democratically what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the revenue. That's what Marx was talking about. And that's going to be on the agenda one way or another, there and here. And then the real question becomes, how will these two systems engage and struggle with the challenge that's coming from below? And the irony, which I don't think is far-fetched, is that they have a lot to get together on. They're afraid of that. They're afraid here in one way, but they're afraid another way there. And that, plus the threat of nuclear war, is more than enough to be able to do together now what Britain and the United States did back in the 19th century.
That's really interesting. And okay, so, and I know you have to jump. I know we're out of time here. You know, where I land at this moment is, you know, what's the bridge from here to there? And I come back to like, well, you know, leadership that is deal maker leadership. Maybe that's how I'll put it. And just because you mentioned Canada at one point, and we're in our own little mess up here, what Canada really needs in office is a deal maker. That's it. We are rich in natural resources. We need a leader who gets the bureaucracy out of the way and allows the provinces to take their product to market should they see fit and help us get deals done. We need a deal maker. That's it, right? Country is bigger than America with less people than the state of California. Like, we don't need that much governance, to be honest. There's not a lot of people here. We don't have the tensions that you find in many other countries. What we do have is resources. And you need that forward-thinking deal maker to come to power in these Western economies to see the bigger picture and the potential future outcomes.
But, you know, here's the irony, and I do have to go. Here's the irony. It's conversations like this that are the only hope. They will generate the thinking, the questioning that will produce those kinds of leaders. They're not going to happen otherwise. I mean, where would they get it from? The institutions of the United States and of Canada, because I'm familiar with those. They're stuck in ways of thinking and conceptualizing that had their role to play, had their usefulness, had some achievements to their credit, no question. I'm not a Monday morning quarterback figuring everything out retroactively, but I am able to say, you don't have the leader, and we don't either in the United States. We don't have anything close to it. I don't, all due respect to Mr. Trudeau, I see nothing. I see nothing, and I look at Mr. Trump, and I look at the Democrats, I see more nothing. I see people who are cheerleaders for what we have, because that's what flies, you know, to a public. But even that public for whom this is done, it makes me feel like the people who beat their children and say it's for the children's good. Yeah, I understand. That makes you feel better when you hit them. But, you know, between you and me, don't hit them, is my reaction.
Richard, this has been an absolute pleasure. I was really looking forward to this conversation, and honestly, it's been a blast. So thank you so much for taking the time and coming to chat with me today.
My pleasure. And if you want to continue the conversation at some time, get back in touch with us. I'd be glad to do it.
100% we'll do that. All right.